Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite you to take the seats and we could start our second plenary session of today. Ladies and gentlemen, I can see that quite many people are in the hall, so maybe I should start. I am very pleased to welcome you into this second session of today. The salience of nuclear weapons after Ukraine. What does it mean to us? And I think we can continue with the first session, some statements that have been said. And the real world, I think this, our session, is quite closely connected to the real world issues. Because what is happening with the Ukraine crisis, it uncovers some vulnerabilities and some questions in security structures and in non-proliferation processes as well and disarmament processes as well. Ukraine, as the country who had nuclear weapons and gave up those weapons in the assurance exchange, now is suffering big problems. And this kind of situation raises the following questions: how to deal with the situation when the assurances have been given and now the country is being attacked. I would like to give the first floor to Mrs. Patricia Flor, who is Federal Commissioner for Arms Control, Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, Federal Foreign Office, Germany, who would like to give a wider overview of the situation. Thank you.
Thank you. And first of all, thank you to the organizers for inviting me. And I would like to focus on three issues in my introductory words. First, indeed, the Budapest Memorandum and, what the Ukraine crisis now means in this context. Secondly, then, what about nuclear rhetoric, and indeed, in this sense, the position of nuclear arms in today's conversation about arms and arms control, and then what do we see as the options for a way forward? Now, first of all, indeed, the illegal annexation of Crimea was a breach of the Budapest Memorandum. And therefore, it's now an example, and in that sense, of course, a very bad example of how security assurances towards a state that is ready to give up its nuclear weapons do not hold at the end of the day. Now, that, of course, sends a very ominous message to everyone. And it's not without impact on, other, states around this world within the context of non-proliferation. And therefore, certainly from our point of view, and Germany as a country which actually adheres to the ultimate objective of a nuclear weapons-free world, so that was a heavy blow to us. And what do we draw from that? From our point of view, it means that we have to look even more seriously today at negative security assurances. Because certainly we don't want that, the breach of the Budapest Memorandum now sets in a cycle of proliferation. So therefore, this issue of negative security assurances is for us one of the issues to focus on, and therefore we at the moment are discussing, could we strengthen negative security assurances? What are the ways to do that beyond the existing NPT framework? Of course, in that context, we would have liked the NPT review conference in May to also conclude with a final document. We couldn't achieve that. For us, that means that we have to strive even more for implementation of the action plan of 2010, because the NPT remains a key pillar of arms control in the field of nuclear weapons. Second issue, nuclear rhetoric in and around the Ukrainian crisis. Now, I think that none of us was used to nuclear rhetoric in the public sphere for the last 2 decades. We just didn't have it. And the reappearance of nuclear rhetoric and the thinking about nuclear weapons as an option within a conflict scenario certainly, rattled all of us. It was a wake-up call. And so therefore, from our point of view, that President Putin mentioned, the possible, option of nuclear weapons in this context is very, very regrettable. Equally regrettable, and that's another issue that we might discuss, is, of course, a threat that nuclear weapons could be stationed, in positions where there are none at this particular point in time. Crimea. So these are all reasons of concern for us, and so therefore our view of nuclear weapons and the salience of nuclear weapons remains that they are a political tool, not a real, military kind of tool. But they are and continue to function, of course, as a deterrence. And it's in this context that I want to say that we support the humanitarian initiative. We want a weapon, we want a world without nuclear weapons, and we certainly don't want to see any time again the use of a nuclear weapon. And we are in the year of the 70th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But if we want to continue on this path towards this vision, we need a step-by-step approach that includes the nuclear weapons states, because we do not have these discussions about nuclear disarmament in a vacuum, and therefore the current security environment certainly doesn't make it easier. What are our options? How do we go about the future? Let me start by saying that, again, now looking at that from a perspective as Germany as a member of NATO, we don't want to see tit for tat. So we don't think that if there is rhetoric which, we disagree with from the other side, we should, then respond with similar rhetoric from our side. So therefore, the key statements of the alliance remain for us valid, even in this changed environment. And therefore, and they say that the nuclear forces of the alliance are the supreme guarantee of the security of the allies. Yes, that continues to hold. But the circumstances in which any use of nuclear weapons might have to be contemplated are extremely remote. And actually that, from our point of view, continues to be true. And therefore, in the Wales, summit declaration, NATO recommitted to this vision of a world free of nuclear weapons. And that is what we would want to continue striving for. Now, after Ukraine, there is no business as usual at the same time. So while key principles remain, we can't simply go on as if nothing happened. And therefore, I think we have to look back into the 60s probably, and also, keep in mind the gist of the Harmel report of 1967, which had two pillars, which is deterrence on the one side and détente on the other side. And these pillars are mutually reinforcing from our point of view. And also, we as a Western Alliance need to find the right balance. And therefore, while we do collective defense, we also need a rules-based, an arms-controlled security environment in Europe, and we need to have a dialogue with the Russian Federation on the other side of this equation. Now, that's why we are fully behind, the strengthening of deterrence and the readiness action plan. But at the same time, we want to go also for cooperative security in Europe. And of course, that's no easy task. It's not easy at this point in time to really talk about risk reduction, prevention of incidents, transparency, confidence-building measures. But that's what we have to do, and therefore we have to keep channels open to our Russian colleagues, and we also have to have military-to-military contacts. From our point of view, arms control is especially salient in times of tension and of possible confrontation. That is where you need the tools, inspections, prior information before we go into exercises, deconflicting, confidence building, red telephones. That's what you need in these times where we are now. And that is also why Germany, as incoming chair of the OSCE in 2016, will have a specific focus on the practical instruments in this field in the OSCE, such as modernization of the Vienna document, looking at open skies, discussing the role of conventional arms instruments after the Ukraine crisis, and also drawing lessons from their use during the Ukraine crisis. To sum up, we think that, yes, there is therefore a nuclear dimension in this sense to the Ukraine conflict, but of course it was, the conflict itself is led by conventional warfare and hybrid warfare. We think that we should hold fast to the goal of a global zero, continue to adhere to the NPT and fully implement the action plan, strengthen negative security assurances, and to end with a final call, there is an offer from President Obama to the Russian Federation, the Russian president, to go into another cycle of disarmament in the nuclear field, a follow-up to New START, and we would very much encourage to take a first step into that direction and to start seriously discussing a further round of nuclear disarmament. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Flora, for a very wide overview of the situation and German position in regards of the situation. And I would like to give the second round, the second floor to Mr. Camille Grant, who is the head of the Strategic Research Foundation and who should also present from the French side and the overall overview of the situation as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. When discussing the salience of nuclear weapons after Ukraine, and I will emphasize in Europe after Ukraine, I'm afraid I'm not going to offer a very rosy picture. My starting point is to insist on the fact that some of the general assumptions of the post-Cold War era have been massively challenged by the most recent development of the last few years, especially in the context of the crisis over Ukraine and the growing tensions with the Russian Federation. Those assumptions were that there was an ever-reduced salience of nuclear weapons in the policies of the P5, that the nuclear dangers in the Euro-Atlantic area were vanishing. Many of us would have started a presentation about nuclear weapons in the 21st century by emphasizing that it was becoming an increasingly Asian issue. Thirdly, that there was a growing convergence in the nuclear postures of Western and Russian forces towards an increasingly existential nuclear posture. And fourthly, that there was a sort of ever-expanding role for arms control in this context. I think that those four trends combined made the risk of a nuclear crisis, let alone nuclear use, very unlikely. And I would argue that these premises are no longer true, at least for the time being, and that nuclear issues have made a dangerous comeback on the European security scene, primarily because of a Russian nuclear brinkmanship posture. So let me elaborate on a few points. First of all, this is not completely new. There is a Russian nuclear modernization process that is ambitious, sustained over time. Of course, it does echo Western nuclear modernization by the United States, France and Britain. All four countries have taken decision in the last few years, and in a way, Russia is a bit catching up on that process after neglecting its nuclear forces in the immediate decade at the end of the Cold War. But in the Russian modernization process, there is a specific emphasis on more usable, short-range nuclear-capable system that is a matter of concern. Second point, I'm struck at the Russian nuclear doctrinal debate, which does emphasize the role of nuclear weapons in the overall military posture, which does envisage an early use in a crisis, and from my perspective signals an over-reliance on nuclear weapons as part of the overall strategic posture, including with strange notions such as the use of nuclear weapons to de-escalate a crisis, which are quite problematic. In this general context, there is a form of significant nuclear signaling, some would argue nuclear saber rattling on the part of Russian authorities, with multiple messages ranging from direct threats, the comments of the Russian ambassador in Copenhagen with regard to the deployment of missile defense capability by Denmark is one example. The on-the-ground multiple practical signaling in the forms of, for instance, overflight of nuclear bombers. If you talk to the French and the British Air Force, having to escort a Russian nuclear-capable bomber in the Channel that is in the middle of the most densely populated airliner region is a bit awkward, and that was a deliberate attempt. By the way, the Russian Air Force felt the need to put this on YouTube for you to share this moment of crisis. Thirdly, large-scale military exercise involving the use of nuclear weapons as part of the training. I think it's specifically about the Zapad exercise, amongst others. All of this creates serious risks of unintended crisis, because my assumption is not that we are on the verge of a nuclear confrontation, but that those signals and practice create de facto a significant risk of a crisis to emerge even unintendedly. Should, for instance, an accident occur with a civilian airliner and an airplane not using its transponder, that's a typical example. What would be the outcome of such a crisis? The fourth point I would like to emphasize is the new practice of a form of nuclear coercion. In a way, the Ukrainian crisis, and specifically the Crimean element of it, is a case for the development of a new form of what we called in the old days aggressive sanctuarization. But this time, this was not the policy of a proliferator that would pursue regional ambitions in the shadow of its emerging nuclear capability, typically the concern over what would have been the Iraq-Kuwait case with Iraq armed with nuclear weapons, but this is one of the P5 that is pursuing this policy. On top of this, we should add the fact that the overall architecture, the European security order, and the arms control regime is under stress. The Budapest Memorandum was just referred to. It was an important pillar of that order. The Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty is no longer in place to a large extent, and this is and we should remember that this conventional treaty followed the INF treaty. So there is a direct connection between our ability to sustain nuclear disarmament in the European context and the fact that there was a conventional forces balance system put in place. Thirdly, of course, there is a debate over INF compliance that is emerging and is quite distressing. These Russian developments have prompted a debate at NATO, which echoes to a degree this. We no longer have a debate about the potential withdrawal of non-strategic nuclear weapons in Europe. The debate is currently more focused at NATO on the modernization process underway. The US government has taken decision to modernize the B-61 and to make the F-35 nuclear capable. Additional decisions are or will be taken by nuclear DCA allies in the alliance with the sort of debates that come with such decisions. There is also a renewed debate about the role of nuclear deterrence in the overall deterrence and defense posture of the alliance, which is likely to, I wouldn't say change the posture of the alliance. By the way, I don't think this is necessary, and I would argue with the fact that there is no need for the alliance to respond in a tit-for-tat or mirror policy to the development on the Russian side. But having said this, there is this ongoing debate which has also a bit of a Cold War flavor. If you add to this development in the missile defense scene, which are still and rightfully so connected to the missile developments in the Middle East, in Iran in particular, nevertheless you have elements that point at the fact that the 21st century could be, including in Europe, more nuclear than expected, not to say more nuclear than the 20th century. So in this rather bleak environment, the issue is, should we simply sit on our hands and wait for the next nuclear crisis to unfold and hope we manage to muddle through these crises as we've done in the past? I would argue that there is room to seriously think about these developments and address them. First of all, we do have a deterrent stability debate. There is a need to rebuild with Russia a common understanding about the role of nuclear deterrence, which is about preventing major wars, both nuclear and conventional, amongst major powers, and not about allowing coercion by nuclear weapon states. From that perspective, a common understanding on the fact that the way we foresee the potential use of nuclear weapons is extremely remote, as in the NATO languages, would be extraordinarily useful. Second point is, I think there is a need to engage in a serious thinking about nuclear CBMs and transparency measures. When it comes to exercising, I think it would be most unfortunate to find ourselves in a situation in which there would be a misunderstanding about nuclear-related exercises, about conventional exercise, so we need to be extraordinarily clear on both sides as we exercise more than we used to. There is a transparency dimension to all of this, and of course the potential deployment or rumors about deployment of nuclear-capable systems, both in Crimea and Kaliningrad on the one hand, and debates on whether the nuclear posture of the North Atlantic Alliance should be reviewed are issues that need to be dealt in a fully transparent manner, and here again I tend to favor the status quo, but transparency is quintessential when it comes to those deployments. Thirdly, I do believe there is a room for a renewed arms control agenda. That might sound a bit rosy after my rather dark assessment, but I do believe that arms control, after all, is even more useful when parties are not in agreement over political issues, because then it serves a very central security purpose, and it's not done out of principle. From that perspective, there is one good news, which is the fact that New START is being implemented, and in spite of all the tensions, this is an ongoing process, and this is a process that is valuable and should be sort of firewalled from other developments, because it is an essential element to build a future with fewer nuclear weapons at the strategic level. On INF, there is obviously a need to re-establish trust over this. My assumption is that Russia is seeking to put INF aside, but there are genuine concerns associated with the testing of some Russian systems. Those should be addressed. And by the way, the mirror concern that Russia raised, which I don't think are quite as legitimate, ought to be addressed as well. This agenda should be probably broader. In a way, we've lost part of the arms control grammar in Europe, and the connection between the conventional side and the nuclear side need to be rethought. The central role of the Vienna document and the need to modernize it in order to establish more transparency and more CBMs should be seriously looked at. I very much look forward to the German efforts during the German OSCE chairmanship to go into this debate heads-on. I think it is a very wise approach. During the Cold War, we did recognize all these linkages. I think we should look through them again, and therefore arms control has a very important role. As a matter of conclusion, of course, the salience of nuclear weapons in the security policies of countries very much depends on the overall geopolitics. However, and even if I put aside politics for a moment, those nuclear risks should be addressed in order to mitigate the dangers of tensions in the Euro-Atlantic area to develop into a major crisis or an unintended significant crisis. Europe and the stakeholders in the Euro-Atlantic area, including the US and Russia, have argued for decades that we were a model for the rest of the world, with a unique web of CBMs, arms control, transparency, and stabilizing role for deterrence. I'm afraid we can no longer lecture Asians or Middle Eastern countries on the fact that they should take Europe for a model, but it's up to us to try to preserve what is still there and to rebuild something that would be meaningful, which again can be developed even in the absence of the sort of favorable political atmosphere that prevailed in the immediate post-Cold War era. In that context, I will wrap up with a bit of a question mark on the role for the EU in that context. My argument would be that a lot of these issues are tackled in other formats, in the NATO-Russia context, in Vienna, in the OSCE context, but that the EU, because it does stand for this rule-based order and also does stand for this approach to stability through a set of norms, and that many of the EU, all of the EU countries do abide these treaties, that we should definitely stand strongly in favor of such a stabilizing role for this web of norms that has played a very important role in preserving peace in the Euro-Atlantic area. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation, Mr. Grant, and I'm very grateful to you that you raised certain questions such as nuclear coercion or Russian military strategy, which is also pointing out nuclear weapons possible usage in the case of de-escalation of the conflict, for instance. So with this note, I would like to go to our further speaker, who is Mr. Arbatov, representing Center for International Security of IMEMO in Russia and chair of Non-Proliferation Program in Moscow, Center Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Mr. Arbatov, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here. One of the greatest paradoxes of the present time is that we have almost an order of magnitude fewer number of nuclear weapons compared to the situation of quarter of a century ago. Since the end of Cold War, we reduced the number of nuclear weapons almost by 10 times, almost. At the same time, the paradox is that the probability of their use is now higher. It's not only higher than 25 years ago, it's probably higher than any time since early 80s. So what are the reasons for this paradox? I think there are several, and I will give you some of them. One reason, of course, is the Ukrainian crisis. The Ukrainian crisis all of a sudden brought relations between Russia and the West, not the whole world, but between Russia and the West, to the times of Cold War. There are many elements of Cold War which are now present in relations between Russia and the United States, Russia and the West. However, the salience of nuclear weapons, the nuclear declarations, and the role of nuclear weapons in the present crisis is higher. Even during the Cold War times, nuclear weapons employment was discussed only in the context of large-scale European war, like the big war, like the Second World War. That was usually the context. Now, nuclear weapons came to the foreground in the context of local crisis. And I think that the reasons for that are as follows. First of all, we're paying now high price for 20 years of neglect of the essence of nuclear deterrence relationship between Russia and the United States and Russia and NATO. I would like to remind you that during the Cold War times, the great powers, having lived through a number of very dangerous crises, made great effort to prevent any situation that might lead to the use of nuclear weapons. First of all, they did it through nuclear arms control, starting with early 70s. Secondly, they did it through special declarations, starting with early 70s, and there were many which officially committed great powers to avoid, with all efforts, any situation that might lead to nuclear war and to armed conflict in principle. And also they elaborated the principles of strategic stability, which were a link between arms control and their intention to prevent any use of nuclear weapons, in particular the nuclear first strike, which actually is in fact the act which may start nuclear war. You know all those, or probably you remember all those joint declarations, statements, arms control treaties, the formulation of strategic stability, in 1990, which laid out the rules of strategic stability, and nothing better was elaborated since that time. Now the Cold War ended, and it played a trick on the world, because the possibility of armed conflict was perceived as a possibility so remote that people just lost interest in the essence of nuclear deterrence, in strategic concepts, in all these things which were very much in the middle of public debate, expertise, scientific research and analysis during the Cold War, especially during the last period of Cold War in the 70s and in the 80s. Remember the attitude towards nuclear arms control in the 90s and during the first decade of the 21st century. You would hardly find any notion that arms control is designed to prevent nuclear war. It was treated mainly as an endeavor which had to do away with Soviet nuclear legacy after dissolution of the Soviet Union, to provide for transparency and predictability, to provide a symbolic adherence to the commitment under Article 6 of the NPT Treaty, but you would hardly find any serious discussion of what constituted the essence of nuclear relationship between Russia and the United States during 25 years. And many of those present here know by their own experience that during that period it was virtually impossible to get any grant for the discussion of the notion of strategic stability, second strike versus first strike, counterforce, and things like that. Everybody just lost interest in that because the possibility of armed conflict seemed close to zero. Now we've returned because of a number of reasons, domestic and external. I don't have time to elaborate on them. We returned in relations between Russia and the West to the situation which is reminiscent of the Cold War. In the meantime, during the preceding 5 years, the military and the engineers were left on their own to develop new strategic and operational planning, to develop new weapon systems, the ways of employment of weapon systems, and when all of a sudden the crisis brought into attention nuclear weapons, the politicians have become captives of those. And the politicians are not experienced in these things. And this is the second major problem of our times. There is a great generation gap between the present politicians and those politicians who lived during the Cold War time. The present-day politicians know very little about that history. They know very little about horrors of crisis management in a relationship of mutual nuclear deterrence. President Putin was 10 years old during the Cuban Missile Crisis. President Obama was 1 year old during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The new politicians came to power after a quarter of a century of unprecedented relaxation of international relations, in particular among great powers. After expansion of nuclear arms control and non-proliferation, they tend to take it for granted, and sometimes they behave in a very cavalier manner with all that. And this is, I think, the essence of the situation that we face now. How do we go from here? What should we do? I think that the Ukrainian crisis and the return of nuclear weapons to the foreground of great power relations and relations between Russia and the West in particular is a good reason for the political leaders of Russia and the United States and European states to reconfirm their former declarations and understandings to the effect that nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought. And to elaborate on that even selective nuclear use should be excluded from relations, and nuclear doctrines should be changed. By the way, I cannot but comment on the several comments here about Russian nuclear doctrine. There is no notion of nuclear de-escalation in the official Russian nuclear doctrine. The last edition of December 2014 provides for the same formulation on the possibility of use of nuclear weapons as the previous 2010 version, and it's very reserved and very limited. I would say that it's more reserved than that of the United States, if you're talking about official doctrines. There was some loose talk of high officials, of ambassadors, but it is not in the Russian nuclear doctrine. There are only two circumstances under which Russia contemplates the use of nuclear weapons. One is a retaliation in case Russia is attacked with nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction. The other case is in a large-scale conventional war, which put under threat the very statehood of the Russian Federation. Obviously, such a state is not something limited. It's a state in which the USSR found itself in the summer and fall of 1941. That's the scenario we are talking about. It's not very much different from that of the United States. The only real difference is that the United States contemplates the use of nuclear weapons to defend American allies. Russia does not contemplate use of nuclear weapons to defend its allies if attacked with conventional forces. That is the only essential difference. Now, what should we do now? Reconfirm, that's the first thing. Reconfirm the notion of strategic stability and elaborate on it. The notion of strategic stability, declared in 1990, provided for a state of strategic relationship which provides no incentive for the first strike. We should elaborate on this, not only massive first strike, but selective, limited first strike should be included. And we should also try to expand this notion to tactical nuclear weapons, which stay out of this consideration of strategic stability. Nobody has formulated what does it mean, strategic stability, as far as tactical nuclear weapons are concerned. Besides that, we should certainly resume arms control negotiations. I think that we are now in a profound and comprehensive crisis of nuclear arms control. For the first time in 50 years, we are now facing the prospect of disintegration of the whole regime and system of nuclear arms control. For the first time, after signing a treaty, which was the New START treaty, for 5 years we have not resumed negotiations on the follow-on treaty. That never happened before. Since the late 60s, every time the treaty was signed, the two sides already had an agenda for the follow-on treaty and started with the follow-on treaty. This is a situation which certainly we cannot reconcile with it. Using the experience of the past and remembering the early 80s, I think that the way to move forward is to disentangle, delink this knot of contradictions that are now blocking the way for nuclear arms control. Follow-on START, ballistic missile defense, conventional strategic systems, precision-guided and prompt global strike systems, tactical nuclear things, tactical nuclear weapons. They are now on in a one knot, which is blocking the way forward. In the past, we had such a situation with nuclear and space talks, which continued for several years and were deadlocked, and then they were delinked, and we had INF Treaty, we had START 1, and as for the space, it evaporated because the Strategic Defense Initiative went way to the background of American strategic policy. So the concern about space weapons for some time disappeared. So we have to disentangle this knot and treat each item on its own terms. Ballistic missile defense, follow on to START, preserve INF Treaty, and for that reason, for the United States to take seriously some of the concerns of Russian Federation, not to dismiss them as unimportant, and address the precision-guided long-range conventional systems separately, and tactical or sub-strategic nuclear weapons as well separately. That is the way to proceed. And certainly we have to think about the way and format of changing the bilateral US-Russian dialogue, not to making it multilateral. We cannot invite third nuclear weapon states to join our negotiations. We have to devise different ways of engaging them in the process of nuclear arms control. And that requires a lot of work, and I hope that we can do that work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Arbatov. Now, I would like to pose a question to Mrs. Flor. How do you see the future of the situation evolving? What kind of ways out would you see in the current situation in terms of Ukraine, in the specter of Ukraine? I know you were talking about, but still, I mean, what is the practical way out? Do you see any ways? Thank you.
Thank you. Now, let me just say that in terms of the Ukraine crisis, of course, the implementation of the Minsk agreement is the key, and that's, the message that was also reaffirmed during the last meeting in the Normandy format by all participants, that we should strive for implementation of Minsk. And of course, I do think that full implementation of the Minsk agreements on Ukraine actually would have a positive impact on the overall security environment. So in that sense, and here let me say that I agree with explicitly with some of also the proposals just made by Mr. Arbatov. We should recommit to the principles of arms control, of confidence building, of the strategic balance. I think it's important to recommit to these principles. That is why I think it's not enough to say there was just some loose talk. I think that the loose talk actually signifies that we have forgotten how sensitive and how important these issues are. I mean, this is part of the problem. In that sense, yes, we have to remind all of ourselves that these are extremely serious issues, and therefore we should recommit to the principles. And I think, yes, another round of engagement in arms control discussions, as I've said before, would be extremely important. And of course, a progress in terms of the Ukraine crisis would, in a sense, also pave the way into that direction. Therefore, it is very important. Can I make a few other comments since you've come? Yes, just to say that yes, in terms of the delinking and linking, again, we encounter that in the Vienna context when we discuss Vienna document modernization, that there are calls for, but if you want to discuss this, then we also have to discuss a lot of other issues, the prompt global strike, and but this actually links then, it leads to a situation where, everything blocks, one thing blocks the other issues and we cannot move forward. So we think that we need to delink the issues, we need to look at each of these issues on its merits. At the same time, however, we need to have a broader dialogue about security in Europe today. Because, again, we need to come together with the Russian Federation and with everybody else in order to look at the threat perceptions, where do we see the risks for today's security in Europe, and then what can we do together towards containing these risks. And I think both of that needs to happen. One comment about the nuclear sphere. CTBT. FMCT. I mean, CTBT will go into its 20th anniversary in 2016. And I mean, it's an amazing instrument because indeed it works in the sense that, the oversight, the surveillance mechanism is in place globally. It's being the organization is being financed despite the fact that the treaty is not in force. So it's amazing, but it's not enough. It should really enter into force because, everybody, in a sense, legally speaking, would be free to make the decision to relaunch, testing. So we should finally bring this treaty into force together using 2016, the anniversary year. And we should do our best to finally also engage in serious discussions about FMCT in Geneva. And let me say that I completely agree with Monsieur Grand that the main risk is unintended escalation, and it's incidents, close calls, and we've had far too many of them already, and so therefore another area that we should focus on is really incident prevention mechanisms in the air, on the seas, in order to avoid that we get into an unintended incident and confrontation that then might spiral out of control. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Flora, and I'm very happy that you touched upon the linkage of various issues, because Mr. Arbatov was claiming that we should delink. So, Mr. Grant, what is your opinion? Should we delink or link the various issues solving the main agenda?
I think many of these issues can be negotiated on their own merit. So I don't think we need to knot them all together, and it's in a way counterproductive. We should, however, admit that there are connections between the issues. So it's extraordinarily difficult, as the Russian Federation insists on the fact that strategic conventional systems are part of the overall strategic equation when it comes to further cuts in strategic systems. And there is a valid point in this statement that the ability to go deeper into tactical cuts in Europe is also connected to the, let's say, stability on the conventional realm. I happen to have been part with some of you in the moment where CFE was frozen by the decision of the Russian Federation, the implementation of CFE. At the time, I think we were a bit cavalier about this. We felt it was okay, that this treaty was not that relevant, that it was a bit of a form of a decision that was, Mr. Putin expressing opposition to Western moves on other fronts by touching on what was seen as the least important arms control treaty. When I look back, I think that it was a very important moment because, in a way, CFE was one of the first arms control treaties in the post-Cold War era. It is something that made possible a lot of choices, and the whole purpose of CFE was to make conventional war impossible in Europe. And guess what? Since CFE vanished, conventional war has made a remarkable comeback in Europe. So sometimes those treaties that seem a bit obscure specialist issues are in fact directly connected to strategic stability and overall strategic stability. So my point here is not in favor of a formal linkage between all the treaties, but into taking into account the global arms control agenda in trying to put together what Alexei and I think that all of us were arguing in favor.
Thank you, Mr. Grant. And Mr. Arbatov, I would like to come back again to Budapest Memorandum, because you didn't touch upon this memorandum when you were presenting your presentation. I don't know if it was intentionally, but still, would it be possible to comment how do you view the situation, the current situation, taking into account the Budapest Memorandum issues and statements? Thank you.
I'm tremendously sorry about everything that happened between Russia and Ukraine. And the state of our relationship now is really a tragedy. And everything that happened in Crimea and Donbass and Lugansk is something that should never have happened. Having said that, I would say that the Budapest Memorandum is not so high on the list of my grievances about this situation. I do not think that what happened to Budapest Memorandum will in any way affect nuclear non-proliferation or nuclear proliferation. There is no such link. When Libya was attacked after disclosing its nuclear sites, many people said, you see, Libya disclosed its possession of some nuclear materials and technologies, and then it was attacked. If it didn't do that, it wouldn't have been attacked. So it will send a bad message to other countries that if they do something secretly and do away with it, then they will be attacked. Well, that didn't happen. We've had an agreement with Iran, which for all its controversies is a positive step forward. So, I repeat again, I think that situation in Europe, return of some elements of Cold War, economic sanctions, close encounters in intensive military exercise between Russia and NATO are all very dangerous and should be done away with as soon as possible. As for Budapest Memorandum and the effect for nuclear proliferation, I think that it's quite low on the list.
Thank you very much. Thank you, really. I would like to give the floor now to the audience. And please present yourself when asking the question. And I will start from the first row, the gentleman over there, and then you, and then you.
Thank you very much. Tarek Rauf from CIPRI. My questions were to Patricia Floor, and particularly your comments at the very end about the importance of the FMCT and the CTBT. And I wanted to relate this to, of the 8 states that have still to sign and or ratify, India and Pakistan are 2 that have not yet signed or ratified. But in the nuclear suppliers group, one of those states has been given an exemption and there was no condition attached for example, India to sign on to the CTBT. So it's very well to call for the entry into force of the CTBT, but where states have leverage, they don't exercise that leverage. And secondly, with regard to the FMCT, its purpose originally was both disarmament and non-proliferation. We have lost the non-proliferation battle with India, Pakistan, DPRK carrying out nuclear tests. So now the value of an FMCT is primarily disarmament, which means it has to include stocks. And a treaty without stocks makes no sense. And I was wondering if you could comment on those. Thank you.
I'm Carlo Trezza from Italy. I think that I share Alexis Arbatov's reading of how we have come back to this Cold War situation in Europe, and the theme of the neglect of nuclear issues for 25 years is indeed one of the causes. I fully agree with him. So we are back to this situation of confrontation. The only non-negative element is that there's no real ideological divide between Russia and the West. So there's no really fundamental issue dividing the two sides. As far as the Budapest Memorandum is concerned, I mean, there's no doubt that Russia did not abide by this text. The lesson learned is that in these cases, and to discipline issues like nuclear security, you need legally binding instruments. And the memorandum is not a legally binding instrument. So I mean, this is a lesson for the future. As far as the use of nuclear rhetoric, this is a serious issue. in the fundamental texts, the use and threat of nuclear weapons is basically put in the same basket. And therefore, I think that leaders should be, and not only leaders, but even officials, should be very cautious in making statements on the use of nuclear weapons without any control. One of the shocks, I think, for Europe as a whole was that all the instruments that we had devised during the Cold War precisely to prevent situations of confrontations, especially within the framework of the OSCE, have not worked. And therefore we are very confident now in the incoming German presidency to handle that subject as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Professor Rafi from Morocco. My first point is upon the Ukrainian crisis. I want to know if when former president, Russian President Medvedev said to the reporter of the newspaper, French newspaper Le Monde, that Russia should intervene in Georgia, even if Georgia was a member of the NATO. And again, he said that when Obama wants to deploy the anti-ballistic missile in Prague, in the Czech Republic, he said we will destroy it. And after that, the President Putin said we will recourse to the nuclear weapons. These events, does it mean that Russia regard these territories as vital interests? Because as you know, there is the use of the nuclear weapons, one of the vital interests of countries and at stake, I think every expert in the nuclear field knows these things. Second point is about the nuclear weapons themselves. I find a little bit naively odd and ridiculous, especially for some Western experts, in the nuclear weapons, who think that it's possible that the nuclear weapons will disappear, because we notice, after the destruction of the Iraqi nuclear program, that the experts, the know-how, the qualified manpower, they immigrate to Libya, and then from Libya to Algeria, and we have also, I think Mr. Arbatov knows this better than me, we have the Russian atomists who immigrate to Iran. So it's impossible. It's possible that nuclear weapons will disappear. I think the nuclear weapons will still be standing weapons, especially we live in this equilibrium. The international security is based on this unique pillar, nuclear weapons. And my last question is to the German Commissioner, which I appreciate very much, her very excellent speech. Some years ago, we have discussed the possibility to destroy the 240 nuclear weapons in Europe, which has been deployed by the Americans from 1957. I think these weapons, to my knowledge, these weapons are deployed in Belgium here, and also in Germany and maybe in Holland. But my question to Patricia Flohr, now after the threat to recourse to nuclear weapons by the Russian Putin, is how is the debate, how is the point of view of the German government? Because I know that the German government, the German country, they fear the invasion of Russia, they now, they are for, the destruction, of these nuclear weapons, or they want to keep them on their soil? And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And in the future, when asking questions, please limit yourself to some short time, because we have a lot of questions, and the time is very short and limited. I would like to invite Mrs. Flohr to answer, and then on the...
Thank you. No, I'll do my best to be brief. First of all, yes, of course we are not naive in terms of CTBT, but we think that we have to try our best to make it enter into force, because I don't think that anybody can seriously argue today that you still need to test nuclear weapons in order to, you know, defend yourself. I don't think it's true, and also not for other, you know, regions of the world, like in Asia or between India and Pakistan. I don't think that this argument holds. Therefore, we think there should be a joint effort by everyone to try to get to ratification. And believe me, I'm saying the same thing in Washington and, you know, in other capitals of the world. And I think it must be a joint effort to get there. On FMCT, well, the issue of stocks, of course, is that's the main hurdle. And I don't have a solution for it. Of course, for Germany as a non-nuclear weapons state, you know, we could easily contemplate to also look at the stocks, but it's a no-go for others. And so therefore, I think that we have to try to get to an entry into discussing these issues at least, because as you know, we haven't even started seriously to really go back into exchanging views and checking, doing what arms control negotiations always were, namely, even if it's very complicated, to identify the tiny element where maybe you can make some progress. So our call is, let's at least start to discuss, you know, these very serious issues again in Geneva. Just one point on the NSA, the nuclear, the negative security assurances. Yes, we think we should look at legally binding element. We should try to see, can we go beyond the NPT? Can we find a way to make it binding? Then nukes never to disappear. Well, I think politicians or diplomats should be realistic and pragmatic, but they should also be visionary. There's no good policy unless you actually know what your final goal is. And you know, if it's easily achievable, that's easy. If it's hard to achieve, it's all the more important to keep this vision in mind, and that it's a step-by-step, that it's a long path, there's no question. But by the way, on this path, at some stage, CTBT, for instance, will be an essential step. Now, nukes in Europe, I mean, the German government view in this, it's not the security environment within which we operate at this moment is not right for actually looking at fundamental changes in terms of, you know, the strategy, the posture. That's where we are. We regret it because certainly, you know, the German public would be, I mean, would immediately, you know, be in favor of, and has called many times, and certainly also our, you know, the main, you know, parties which, you know, are part of the German government also would want to move into that direction, but it will require a certain security environment. Therefore, we try to improve the environment where we are in at the moment.
Thank you. Mr. Arbatov, your comments.
Well, as far as I could understand the question, I think my neighbor responded very well.
No, please, Mr. Grant, your comments.
Very, very quickly, I very much subscribe to what has been told on FMCT and CTBT. The only thing I would add is that those a bit neglected multilateral agreements or negotiations are important in the general atmospherics as well, because it does mean that experts, diplomats do meet to look into issues, and I think it fosters effort from more bilateral processes. On the Budapest Memorandum, yes, we should favor legally binding instrument. I would be slightly less optimistic than Alexei on the impact on the non-proliferation regime. I tend to believe that now it would be almost impossible to sell to any country denuclearization based on a promise, especially if it's not legally binding, not to attack them in the future. And by the way, this was not part of the Iran nuclear agreement. Lastly, on NATO and tactical nukes. We should keep in mind that NATO has reduced the number of weapons deployed to Europe by the US by, I think, 98% since the peak of the Cold War. This is quite unique. By the way, it's a story that can't be told because NATO is not transparent about these numbers. So this is something that I always challenge a bit with my NATO friends, that when you have a good story, you should be in a position to tell it. Fortunately, WikiLeaks solves part of that problem, but nevertheless, it is there. This is important. A last point on the issue of NATO membership. We do have in Europe a grey zone problem. That is those countries that are in between NATO and the Russian Federation, with each have their own foreign policy agenda, and this is not surprisingly where a lot of the security developments have taken place. To this date, and I certainly hope and I'm quite certain it will remain true, for NATO and EU members, the issue is not there in the same terms. But this is something that is part of a problem and should be part of a conversation about stability in Europe. Thank you very much.
Yes, there was a question, right, which was, yes, Russia considers post-Soviet space as an area of vital interest, vital security interest, no question about it. Deployment of foreign troops or ballistic missile defenses in this area would be seen as a threat to Russian security. It doesn't mean that Russia would attack either with conventional or nuclear weapons those sites, just like the sites in Poland or Romania or Turkey. But it means that Russia will consider those sites to be legitimate targets for Russian conventional precision-guided systems like Iskander or even nuclear systems in case of nuclear war. There was, as I mentioned, there was loose talk about nuclear weapons on the side of Russia, but there were even more loose interpretation in the West of what was said. If you look through all the declarations of Putin and Medvedev, all those declarations were made in the context of nuclear deterrence, not in the context of Russia attacking somebody. Some words of some ambassadors were not officially authorized, no question about that. But you should look at what Minister of Defense, Foreign Minister, Prime Minister, President say. They were saying it in the context of nuclear deterrence. Should they have done it? No. I think that it was wrong to put such an accent on nuclear weapons in the context of Ukrainian crisis. That was wrong. But those people making decisions in the Kremlin, they were scared by the possibility of NATO intervention in Crimea, Donbass, and Lugansk. And their perception of the West was as of quite an aggressive alliance, which moved to Russian borders during the last 20 years, very close. Hence, they maybe have overdone their warnings. But they always talked about deterrence, not about being the first to attack. Now about ballistic missile defense. Russia considers ballistic missile defense in Europe to be directed against Russian nuclear deterrence. I personally think that this is very exaggerated perception, that the system deployed in Europe now is no threat to Russian nuclear deterrence. But there is another opinion which is obviously shared in the Russian government and political elite, the majority of the political elite. And I would suggest that the United States did very little to really dispel this concern. They did very little to make commitments that defense will be limited so that it does not threaten Russian strategic deterrence. We know that the current program cannot do that. Experts know it. But it's an open-ended program, and it may continue and expand, especially if there is a change in administration. We have no commitments on the part of the United States that it would somehow be limited. So that's why there is this concern in Russia. And the last comment is that about reconfirming our understanding that nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought. Recently at Valdai, President Putin, all of a sudden, after talking about Syria, made several extensive comments on the subject. He referred to the leaders of the past who were responsible. He referred to present leaders who are not so responsible, and he repeated, even if indirectly, the notion that nuclear war will be devastating and there may be no victors in nuclear war. Maybe it was a signal to President Obama to say something like that, and I will be waiting and following whether President Obama would also reiterate on this subject in the same way.
Thank you very much. And then I promised the gentleman in the middle, yes, and I will continue with the left side, and after on the next part we will continue with the right side. So the gentleman in the middle, then the gentleman on the very left, and the other gentleman in the very back. So please.
Okay, Tom Sauer from the University of Antwerp.
And I'm sorry to remind you to limit yourself in some short
Belgium.
time.
Camille Grand linked the B-61 issue to the Ukraine crisis. Now, it should, however, be clear that no serious efforts were made to withdraw these last B-61 bombs in the years before the Ukraine crisis. So the Ukraine crisis misused by the advocates of those bombs in Europe, including the French. And as far as I know, Germany is planning to replace the current dual-capable aircraft with non-dual-capable aircraft, Eurofighter, which means phasing out the B-61 role by default in 5 or 10 years. And also my own government, Belgium, has not yet decided to renew the DCA role. And the Dutch parliament passed a motion for a non-nuclear Joint Strike Fighter in 2013. So there's an opportunity for coordination amongst Germany, Belgium and the Netherlands, I believe. So prove that this step-by-step approach is working.
Thank you. Gentleman in the very left over there. No, not you. It's somebody else over there asking. Yes, you, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Ted C. from BASIC in London, and I'd like to echo what Dr. Sauer just said, particularly in challenging the representative of the German government who made an on-the-record statement that Germany is a non-nuclear weapons state. And in the same sense the EU claims to have clean hands on nuclear nonproliferation, I have to challenge both of those assertions because of the presence since the 1950s on inter alia German soil of U.S. nuclear weapons, when the clear plan on NATO's part is in time of crisis or war to turn those weapons over to the very capable hands of the Luftwaffe.
Thank you. And then the gentleman in the, yes, in the very last row over there. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Heinz Gärtner. I'm from Vienna. I have a question to Patricia Flohr. You just said that NATO is not going to change its nuclear posture anytime soon. But at the beginning you said you would support the humanitarian dimension. So I don't see any possible progress in the humanitarian dimension if you don't address the nuclear posture of NATO. I just want to remind you of among those about 120 states which signed the humanitarian pledge was not only no nuclear weapon states, but there was also no NATO member. So I don't know how you can bridge this gap, supporting the humanitarian dimension at the same time accepting the nuclear posture, so especially what we heard from the panel after the Ukraine crisis.
Thank you. And now the answers.
Yes, thank you. Now, I'll start with the last question. Now, there was always a German delegation at the different conferences on the humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons, because we completely agree that any use, and I reminded of Nagasaki and Hiroshima earlier, any use of such a weapon has catastrophic humanitarian consequences, and so certainly nobody should therefore ever contemplate using these weapons. And with that, we completely agree. That was the key part of the humanitarian initiative when they started. Now, the Austrian pledge and the call for a ban convention against nuclear weapons, that's a step more, and that is a step which we cannot take. We cannot take it because at this moment we don't see that the P5 and those who actually do possess nuclear weapons would in any way be ready actually to sign up to this convention. And what is the use of an instrument that does not really get those who do possess these kind of weapons to disarm and to then bring us closer to our vision of a world free of nuclear weapon? So the contradiction from our point of view is also in this proposal, which is the reason why we will work and continue to work with the humanitarian initiative. But we think that the way to bring forward our vision is this very tedious and painful step-by-step process where we have to bring the weapon states along towards nuclear disarmament. Therefore, we welcome full implementation of New START, and we would wish to see another round of disarmament. Nuclear sharing. Well, it is very clear, legally speaking, that Germany and the practice of nuclear sharing is completely in line with the NPT. And as you know, of course, Germany is a treaty party to the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state. So it's very clear, and therefore, any claim that there would be a contradiction does not hold true. The practice of nuclear sharing actually predates the NPT, and the then Soviet Union at the time, also was fully aware of this fact and accepted it by acceding to the NPT. So there is no contradiction, and certainly also no, legal issue here. But I repeat, the practice and the deployment, it's part of the overall security environment. And so in that sense, I do think that, we have to relook at that over and over again, but we need to do it in the context of hopefully also arms control talks and progress. And at the moment, we don't have that in the security field.
I would like to give the floor to Camille Grant.
Very briefly on the issue of the B-61, what I was pointing at is that I perceive that the debate is evolving. Most of the debate of the last 10 years was about should these weapons be removed or not. There is indeed a continued push on some part of the, especially civil society, political parties in Europe in favor of that move, but there is also more of a debate about a growing debate on the need to modernize systems. So my main point here was to state that when the, let's say, general thrust of the debate was towards elimination of the system eventually on a unilateral basis, this is no longer the policies of NATO countries as we speak. There is indeed a debate in NATO. There's also a debate in the US, and the decisions have been taken by the Obama administration to modernize these systems and to give a dual capability to the F-35 that will ensure that the systems are able to operate in the medium to long term. And then there is indeed a debate in the countries that operate those dual capable aircrafts. And there is a strong disconnection between those that have taken decisions to buy the F-35 and will therefore de facto be able to operate the B-61 in the future, Italy, Turkey, potentially the Netherlands, even though there is a political decision to be associated with that, and the countries that have not yet taken such a decision, which for the moment are sort of prolonging the lifespan of the existing aircraft. This is a decision that will have to be taken by the Belgian government and the German government, because indeed there is at some point in the future, there will be a technical issue to be fixed, which is even if you station the weapons, if you don't have the planes to fly them, you're de facto moving out of the DCA game. But my real emphasis is on the fact that this debate has, I think, fundamentally changed, not because of Ukraine, but not even though it was not stated this way. I think it is a changing and evolving debate. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Arbatov, you wanted to ask something?
Tactical nuclear weapons certainly are a legitimate subject for arms control, but it requires a lot of innovative thinking and exploration to find a way of dealing with those. Mechanically applying strategic arms control experience to tactical nukes is a non-starter. They are very different weapons. They are not kept on day-to-day alert. They are in storages in peacetime. You cannot count them by counting delivery systems, because the delivery systems are dual purpose. You cannot apply the notion of parity to tactical nukes, because, for instance, in Russia, tactical nukes are not only assigned the tasks in the West, and Russia's geostrategic situation has to be taken into account. And you cannot apply the notion of strategic stability, which is based on secure second strike retaliation. You cannot apply that to tactical nuclear weapons either. So you have to do a lot of thinking before proposing it or making it a practical negotiation. In the past, some years ago, President Obama proposed to cut down strategic nuclear arms after a new start, to lower ceiling, and also to bunch together tactical nukes. That was done on the wave of euphoria about the progress towards nuclear disarmament, so nobody cared to ask those practical questions. Now that we will have to postpone total and comprehensive nuclear disarmament for some time into the future, is the time to think about practicalities of tactical nukes to make it possible when political situation becomes more favorable.
Thank you very much. And now I need to apologize the right side of the audience, because the organizers are very strict with me, and they told me that I have to stop at this point the discussion, as we have a lunch in our agenda waiting for us. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to stop here, and I would like to encourage you to ask the questions during the lunch or during coffee breaks. And I would like to invite you to applaud our very interesting, very knowledgeable speakers who presented very well today. And enjoy your lunch. Thank you. The next session at 1 o'clock. Please don't be late.
Thank you.